Words are like keys. Chapter 1. A Gift from the Past. When my grandfather was still a young doctor, fate had the chance to meet an extraordinary artist, Solomon Borisovich Yudovin. Their meeting took place in western Ukraine, in the post-war years, when the air was still filled with memories, and people's hearts with hope for the revival of beauty. Yudovin was a man of rare spirituality. An inner fire shone in his eyes, and his brush seemed to transfer to the canvas not only visible details, but also something elusive, thoughts and feelings hidden between layers of paint. My grandfather was then a young doctor, loved music, books, and leisurely walks along the riverbank. He took part in scientific expeditions to Jewish shtetls with the aim of collecting and preserving Jewish heritage in the field of traditional medicine. One such evening, at a party at a mutual friend's house, he heard Yudovin talking about his travels through Jewish shtetls, about people, faces, and stories that he painstakingly transferred to paper and canvas. They got to talking, found a common language, and then became friends. Some time later, when my grandfather was getting ready to leave, Yudovin presented him with an unusual gift, 3 small engravings, each of which depicted scenes from life that seemed simple, but at the same time mysterious. My grandfather accepted this gift with gratitude, not suspecting that there was much more behind it than just artistic value. Chapter 2. Hidden Meanings. In our house, these paintings hung modestly, almost unnoticeably. One was a house with a large sign depicting a man in a fashionably tailored suit, another, with an old Jew sitting on the threshold of his grocery store, the third, with a tailor sewing at an open window. Only occasionally would my grandfather glance at them with a thoughtful smile, and I, as a child, would sometimes ask myself, what is it that he sees in them? I remember how on rainy evenings, when drops drummed on the windowsills and the yard smelled of wet earth, I would climb into an armchair covered in coarse pre-war fabric and watch my grandfather. Then the house seemed to me like a ship sailing away to unknown lands. My grandfather would sit by the window, behind which a spot of lamplight was burning, and look around at the paintings. "You know," he would suddenly say, "every house has its own portraits of memory." I did not understand why he called them portraits, if one depicted a house, another a bench, and only the third resembled a real portrait. But my grandfather did not explain, he only smiled his soft, slightly sad smile. Time passed, and the paintings still hung in their places, above the old chest of drawers, between the bookshelves, in the dark hallway. I grew up, but I still sometimes stopped in front of them, examining details I hadn't noticed before: the sewing needle in the tailor's machine, the tiny brass bell by the door of the shop, the folds on the cuff of the fashionable suit of the man on the sign. When I was 6 years old, I decided to ask my grandfather about the paintings. We were sitting in the kitchen, the tea in the faceted glasses had grown cold, and it was still raining outside. "Grandfather, who are these people?" I asked. "Why do you always look at them like that?" My grandfather was silent for a long time, and then he stood up and gestured for me to follow him. We stopped at the first painting, a house with a sign. "This is what a tailor in a Jewish shtetl looked like," he said. "This tailor was a dreamer like you. This sign shows his work, his pride. He designed the suits himself and made them for people from all over the city. They said that wearing suits from Zalman brings good luck." I turned my gaze to the second painting, an old Jew at a shop. "This is what Morduk, my friend's father, looked like. He owned a grocery store that always smelled of spices and tart wine. People came to talk to him, to buy something for a holiday, or just to watch him sit on the threshold, bask in the sun and tell stories. He knew the price of every product, but even more, every word. I listened, imagining how I would pass by this shop, hear the ringing of the bell, smell fresh apples and wet boards. Grandfather led me to the third painting, a tailor by the window. "This is what a very famous tailor in our town looked like," he suddenly said quietly. "Many years ago, when I left to study, he sewed me a suit. The artist painted him like this, in a simple vest, sitting at a sewing machine and hoping for better times. He said that work is not only a craft, but also a way to preserve memory. From then on, when I passed by these paintings, they were no longer just wall decorations for me. A whole world lived in them, which my grandfather carefully passed on to me, not telling, but showing how important it is to remember your roots. When it became difficult for my grandfather to get up from his chair, and he looked out the window more than at the paintings. Sometimes he would ask me to tell him what I remembered about each of the characters in these canvases, as if checking to see if I had forgotten something important. In one of our last conversations, my grandfather said, These paintings are not just memories of people. They are memories of choices, to be honest, to work, to respect others, and not to lose yourself, no matter who you become. When my grandfather passed away, the house was filled with silence. For a long time, I hesitated to change anything, or even touch these paintings. It seemed to me that if I took them down, the thread that connected me to the past would disappear. But one day I realized, memory is not in the canvases or the frames, it is in ourselves, in our actions and words. Then I took the paintings down and took them to my new apartment. There, too, they took their places, modestly, almost imperceptibly, but for me, inseparable. Now, sometimes, when my son or granddaughter asks who these people are, I smile and tell them the same story that I once heard from my grandfather. I talk about the tailor who made suits so that they were remembered for decades. About the shopkeeper who knew the value not only of goods, but also of every kind word. About the artist who believed that love and work can preserve memory. Over the years, the paintings seem to blossom with new colors. I increasingly catch myself thinking that these familiar scenes contain more meaning than meets the eye. Maybe this is the true power of memory, the ability to see a whole life behind simple things, and pass it on. Many years later, when my grandfather was no longer with me, the paintings came to me. One autumn evening, when the rain was pounding the glass, and the house was quiet, I suddenly felt as if these old canvases were beginning to speak to me. Their plots formed a certain sequence, a mysterious story, and I decided to try to unravel their secret. Chapter 3. Research. I started with the very first painting. At first glance, it was an ordinary engraving, trees slightly leaning over the roof of a house, a slanted porch. But if you looked more closely, you could see that among the branches there were thin lines resembling letters. I took a magnifying glass and saw Shalom, and then more. In the second painting, on the sign of a shop, several more letters were hidden, Zahar, which in Hebrew means remember. I began to guess that the artist put something more into his works than it seemed at first glance. A slight excitement was then mixed with childish excitement. Each picture revealed a new layer, as if I were reading a message from the past. The third painting, a tailor at an open window, turned out to be the most mysterious. On the sewing machine there was a tiny engraving, almost erased by time. I could barely make out. Listen. An extraordinary feeling came over me. The words formed a chain, like keys to some ancient secret. And finally, above the roof of the house, in the clouds, like a shadow, the word appeared, light. I held my breath, feeling how the room was filled with this soft, barely perceptible glow. The meaning slowly began to form a complete picture. The world enclosed in these works was filled with memory, light and hope, addressed to everyone who knows how to see beyond the obvious. I looked around. The room was empty, and only the warm light of the lamp was reflected in the glass of the frames. Suddenly, I realized that the solution to these messages was not just an artistic game, but perhaps an invitation to look deeper into my own life, to remember, to listen, to carry light, and to meet the world with peace in the soul. I suddenly felt something new in the cool evening air, an invisible whisper of ancient words that might have always been there, if you just looked closely. Chapter 4. Message. I sat for a long time, lost in thought, going over the words I had found. Shalom. Zahar. Listen. Light. What did it mean? I began to remember conversations with my grandfather, his stories about Yudovin, about the traditions and lessons of the past. And suddenly it dawned on me, these were the key words of ancient prayers, instructions that were passed down from generation to generation. Shalom is not just a greeting, but a wish for peace and wholeness. Zahar is a memory of those who came before us, of roots and history. Listen is a call to attentiveness, to the ability to hear and understand not only words, but also silence and hints of life. Light is a symbol of hope, faith, and inner clarity. All this together formed a quiet, almost invisible instruction. Peace be with you. Remember, listen, and bring light. Not just words, but a kind of testament left by the artist through his brush and through friendship to remind us of the most important things. My grandfather spoke about Yudovin with special respect. His stories were filled with admiration, not only for the artist's talent, but also for his ability to see beauty in simple things, in a ray of sunlight on an old wall, in the pattern of a fence, in the face of a tired woman at the market. Look, my grandfather would say, Yudovin didn't just paint. He listened, remembered, and brought light, as best he could. Once my grandfather showed me a small engraving. It depicts a Jewish boy standing at the door of his home, holding a lantern in his hands, and an expression of expectation and hope on his face. "This is not just the light in his hands," my grandfather explained. "This is what he carries on, despite all the difficulties." Our evening conversations would surface in my memories. We were sitting in the kitchen, when the twilight was already thickening outside the windows, and a cold wind was running through the yard. Grandfather poured tea, sighed, watched the steam rise, and began his story. "Do you know what Zahar is? It is not just memory. It is a duty to remember names, stories, traditions. To remember in order not to lose yourself. And shalom is not only peace, but also fullness, completeness. When a person has shalom inside, he becomes whole." Sometimes grandfather fell silent, and into this silence the word "listen" entered. I learned to catch not only his voice, but also pauses, glances, hand movements, everything that made up the invisible fabric of communication. At such moments, it seemed that someone else was standing behind grandfather's shoulders, the shadows of ancestors, their wisdom, their prayers. Chapter 5. The Secret Revealed. After this discovery, I began to look at the paintings differently. Each detail became part of the overall pattern, and the canvases themselves became an integral part of our family tradition. I began to read more about Yudovin and his works, to study the symbolism of Jewish art, to look for echoes of these words in his other paintings and engravings, and also in ancient relics that had long been kept in our family. I told my family about my find, and we decided to keep these paintings as a family heirloom, passing on the secret message further, to children and grandchildren. It became for us not only a reminder of our ancestors, but also a quiet landmark in the hustle and bustle of modern times. Chapter 6. Heritage. Since I deciphered this code, every evening, passing by these paintings, I seemed to hear the voice of my grandfather, who once heard the wisdom of the artist. And now I understand. The true value of art is not only in colors and lines, but also in the meanings it conveys to those who are ready to look and listen attentively. So Yudovin's paintings became not just wall decorations, but also a starting point for thinking about the world, memory, the ability to listen, and the ability to carry light through generations. The house changes, people leave, but the paintings of the past live on. Some will see in them simply scenes of everyday life, others, family legends. But I know, behind every brushstroke, behind every detail, there is a story that is important to tell, so that even in 100 years someone in a new house would freeze at the wall and ask, "Grandpa, who are these people?" After my grandfather's death, I avoided this room for a long time. The ghosts of the past seemed heavy and inexorable. Books, letters, the smell of old paper reminded me of lost time. But that evening I decided to go in, open the desk drawer, and found an envelope with those very words. I sat, sorting through them, and suddenly felt something change. Memories were coming together in a pattern, like a mosaic, as if the space itself was filled with meaning. The word shalom sounded inside, not as a formal greeting, but as a deep wish. May everything be well, may peace descend on this house, on this memory. I touched the word Zahar, and it was as if I felt under my fingers the handshake of those who lived before me. Their shadows were nearby, prompting, guiding. I remembered stories about my grandfather's grandmother, who lit candles on Saturdays until her last day, taught her grandchildren to listen to the rustle of the rain, and always repeated, "Remember, we are part of something bigger." Listen turned out to be the most difficult word. In a world where everything is filled with noise, where everyone strives to be heard, hearing is truly not easy. Listening means being open to the world, accepting it without judgment, learning to distinguish a voice among endless echoes. And light. Light is what you carry even when it seems like the darkness is thickening. It is an act, a look, a word of support. Light is an opportunity to be hope for someone else, even if you yourself do not always believe in miracles. I looked again at Yudovin's engravings and suddenly realized, my grandfather and the artist were talking about the same thing. It does not matter how much time has passed and how many people have changed, the meaning remains in simple things, in the ability to wish for peace, to remember, to listen, and to carry light. I carefully folded the leaves back into the envelope, wrote on the envelope, "Testament," and put it next to the photograph of my grandfather. Let these words be kept further. Let someone else find them one day and think about them. That evening, I went out onto the porch, breathed in the cool air. Stars were slowly scattering over the city. I remembered the instruction, "Peace be with you." Remember, listen, and carry light. These words resonated in me with unexpected lightness. I felt my grandfather's presence nearby, not as a shadow, but as an inner voice, calm and clear. Many days passed, but I kept returning to these words. They became for me not just a memory of the past, but a guiding thread in the present. I began to listen more often, to the silence in the mornings, to the voices on the street, to my thoughts. I began to look for light, in other people's smiles, in good deeds, in the ability to forgive. Every meeting, every conversation became a reminder. Shalom, Zakar, listen, light is more than letters. It is a meaning that we carry on, sometimes without even realizing it. And now, when someone asks me about the covenant, I smile and say, words are like keys. They open doors not only to the past, but also to the future. May your path be bright. I put together the story about my grandfather, about Yudovin, about the words I found. This became my main discovery, the understanding that the covenant does not disappear as long as memory, attention, and light in hearts are alive. Let these simple words be passed on, like a quiet fire, like a melody that sounds through the centuries. And let everyone who hears them one day think, what does it mean to be a keeper of goodness, peace, and light? And maybe one day he will also tell his story, so that the echo of words never ceases.